When Clara Bennett's diary landed in the hands of billionaire CEO Jonathan Drake, the last line she wrote would expose a secret that could destroy them both or set them free. Have you ever lost something so personal that finding it again could change your entire life? Stay with me until the end of this incredible story, and comment below what city you're watching from so I can see how far this tale has traveled across the world. The morning rain hammered against the towering glass walls of Drake Industries, like bullets against armor, each drop exploding into 1,000 fragments before sliding down into the urban abyss below. Clara Bennett pressed her face against the elevator's cold metal wall, her breath fogging the polished surface as she clutched her worn leather messenger bag with trembling fingers. 23 floors up, and her heart was already threatening to burst from her chest. She was late. Again. Come on, she whispered to the glowing numbers above the door, watching them climb with agonizing slowness. 15, 16, 17. Each floor took her further from the safety of anonymity and closer to the executive level where Jonathan Drake ruled his empire with the precision of a Swiss timepiece and the ruthlessness of a corporate predator. The elevator chimed softly as it reached the 23rd floor, and Clara stepped into the pristine marble lobby that served as the gateway to the executive suites. The receptionist, a perfectly polished woman named Victoria, whose smile never quite reached her ice-blue eyes, looked up from her computer screen with the kind of practiced disdain reserved for the lower-tier employees. "You're 17 minutes late, Miss Bennett," Victoria said, her voice carrying the crisp efficiency of someone who had never struggled to make rent. Mr. Drake's assistant called down twice looking for the quarterly reports. Clara's stomach dropped like a stone into dark water. The quarterly reports. She had spent the entire weekend compiling those numbers, cross-referencing every detail, until her eyes burned and her fingers cramped from typing. They were supposed to be on Jonathan's desk by 8:30 sharp, and here she was stumbling in at nearly 9 with rain-soaked hair and a coffee stain on her blouse that she hadn't noticed until this very moment. "I have them right here." Clara managed fumbling through her bag with increasingly frantic movements. Her fingers brushed against her father's old diary, the leather journal she carried everywhere filled with her most private thoughts and observations about life in the corporate tower. She pushed it aside, digging deeper for the manila folder that contained 3 months of her life's work. The folder wasn't there. Panic hit her like a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs and sending her heart into a wild rhythm that echoed in her ears. She dumped the contents of her bag onto Victoria's pristine desk, ignoring the woman's sharp intake of breath as pens, loose change, and crumpled receipts scattered across the white surface. I had them," Clara stammered, her voice rising with each word. "They were right here. I put them in last night after I finished the final calculations. They have to be here." But they weren't. Somewhere between her tiny studio apartment and the executive floor, 3 months of work had vanished into the ether. Clara's hands shook as she sifted through the debris of her professional life, each item mocking her with its uselessness. Lip balm, subway card, a grocery list written on the back of a bank envelope. And there, sitting among the chaos like an accusation, was her father's diary. The diary that contained every secret thought she'd ever had about this place, about the questionable deals she'd overheard in empty conference rooms, about the way the executives treated their employees like expendable resources, and most dangerously of all, about Jonathan Drake himself, the man she should fear, should resent, should view as nothing more than another corporate overlord drunk on power and privilege. The man she had foolishly, recklessly, impossibly fallen in love with. "Miss Bennett," Victoria's voice cut through Clara's spiral of panic like a blade. "Perhaps you left the reports in your apartment. You could call and have someone..." "No." Clara's voice was barely a whisper. She knew exactly where those reports were, and the knowledge hit her like ice water in her veins. She had left them on her kitchen table right next to the diary she thought she was carrying. In her exhaustion and stress, she had grabbed the wrong item, bringing her most private thoughts into the very place they could destroy her. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what she had written in that diary just last night, in the final entry that filled the last page of the leather-bound book her father had given her for her 18th birthday. The entry that began with a detailed account of the Westridge merger, the deal that had been keeping her awake at night, with its suspicious terms and convenient timing. The entry that ended with 7 words that could cost her everything. I think I'm falling in love with him. I need to go, Clara said, already backing toward the elevator. I need to get those reports. Tell Mr. Drake I'll have them to him within the hour. But Victoria was shaking her head, her expression shifting from disdain to something that might have been pity. I'm afraid that won't be possible, Miss Bennett. Mr. Drake specifically requested that you come to his office the moment you arrived. Apparently, he has something that belongs to you. The world tilted on its axis, and Clara had to grip the edge of Victoria's desk to keep from falling. Something that belongs to me. A diary, I believe he said. Brown leather, rather worn. He found it in the executive conference room this morning. The elevator ride to the 25th floor lasted an eternity and ended far too soon. Clara's reflection stared back at her from the polished doors, pale, wide-eyed, looking every inch the frightened girl from the wrong side of town, who had somehow stumbled into a world of marble floors and 7-figure salaries. Her father would have told her to lift her chin, to walk into that office like she belonged there. But her father had been dead for 3 years, and his advice felt as distant as starlight. The executive floor was a study in understated power. The walls were lined with original artwork that cost more than Clara made in a decade, and the carpet was so thick it swallowed the sound of her footsteps completely. She passed the offices of vice presidents and senior directors, each one a monument to success that felt as foreign to her as a museum exhibit. Jonathan Drake's office sat at the end of the hall like a throne room, its double doors crafted from dark wood that gleamed under the soft overhead lighting. Clara had only been inside twice before, once during her interview, 6 months ago, and once to deliver documents when his regular assistant was out sick. Both times she had been struck by the sheer scale of the space with its floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a commanding view of the city below, and furniture that looked like it belonged in an Italian villa rather than a corporate office. She knocked softly, her knuckles barely making a sound against the heavy wood. Come in. His voice reached her even through the thick doors, rich and commanding, with an undertone that made her stomach flutter in the most inappropriate way. Clara pushed open the door and stepped into the lion's den. Jonathan Drake stood with his back to her, silhouetted against the massive windows that framed the city skyline. At 35, he was young for a CEO of a Fortune 500 company, but everything about him radiated the kind of confidence that came from never having to question his place in the world. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his charcoal suit tailored to show off broad shoulders and a lean frame that spoke of early morning workouts and careful attention to detail. When he turned to face her, his green eyes held an intensity that made Clara feel like he could see straight through to her soul. And there, sitting on his massive mahogany desk like evidence in a criminal trial, was her father's diary. Miss Bennett, Jonathan said, his voice carrying no trace of emotion. Please sit down. Clara remained frozen in the doorway, her eyes locked on the diary. From this distance, she couldn't tell if it was open, couldn't see which page might be displayed for his viewing. But she knew with horrible certainty that he had read it. All of it. Every observation about the company's questionable practices, every personal reflection on her struggle to fit into this world of privilege and power, and most damaging of all, every tortured word about her growing feelings for the man who now stood before her like a judge waiting to deliver a verdict. "I can explain," she began, but Jonathan held up a hand to silence her. "Can you? Because I've spent the last hour reading this, and I find myself more confused than when I started." He picked up the diary, handling it with careful precision, and Clara noticed that his hands, those strong, capable hands that signed million-dollar deals and shaped the fate of thousands of employees, were actually trembling slightly. "You have quite an observant eye, Miss Bennett, and a talent for seeing things that others might miss." Clara forced herself to walk toward the chair he had indicated, her legs feeling like they were made of glass that might shatter at any moment. "Mr. Drake, I never meant for anyone to read that. It's private, and Private, yes, but also illuminating." Jonathan opened the diary to a page near the middle, and Clara caught a glimpse of her own handwriting, the neat, careful script her father had taught her when she was 7 years old. For instance, this entry from 2 weeks ago, where you detail your concerns about the Westridge merger. You note several irregularities in their financial statements that our entire due diligence team seems to have missed. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She had written that entry after overhearing a conversation between 2 board members in the executive washroom, their voices echoing off the marble walls as they discussed numbers that didn't match the official reports. She had spent hours that night researching Westridge Corporation, following paper trails that led to shell companies and offshore accounts that made her stomach turn with their implications. "I wasn't trying to spy," she said quickly. I hear things sometimes, and when numbers don't add up, I notice." "You notice?" Jonathan repeated, closing the diary and setting it down carefully. "Yes, I can see that. You notice quite a lot, don't you, Miss Bennett? The way Gerald Henderson from accounting has been working late every night for the past month, shredding documents that should be going to the archives. The fact that 3 of our best investigators have suddenly requested transfers to other departments after being assigned to the Westridge project. The convenient timing of board member resignations just before crucial votes. Each observation hit Clara like a physical blow. She had written about all of those things, connecting dots that had formed a picture she didn't want to see. But hearing them spoken aloud in Jonathan's measured voice made them sound less like paranoid observations and more like evidence of something much larger and more dangerous than she had imagined. "I probably shouldn't have written any of that down," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was just trying to make sense of things. My father always told me to pay attention to details. That's how you survive in places like this." Something shifted in Jonathan's expression at the mention of her father. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and for a moment Clara saw past the carefully constructed facade to something raw and vulnerable underneath. "Your father was a smart man," Jonathan said quietly. "Smarter than most people gave him credit for." Clara's breath caught in her throat. "You knew my father, David Bennett. He worked in our acquisition department for 15 years before—" Jonathan trailed off, but Clara could fill in the blank. Before the heart attack that had taken him at 52, leaving behind a mountain of medical debt and a daughter who had to drop out of college to pay for his funeral. "He never mentioned knowing you personally," Clara said, though even as the words left her mouth, she realized how naive they sounded. Jonathan Drake wouldn't have had any reason to interact with a mid-level analyst in acquisitions, no matter how smart that analyst might have been. "We only met once," Jonathan admitted, moving around his desk to lean against its edge, bringing him closer to Clara than they had ever been before. She could smell his cologne, something expensive and subtle that made her think of mountain forests and winter nights. It was about 6 months before he died. He came to see me about some irregularities he had discovered in a merger we were considering, a small biotechnology company that seemed too good to be true. Clara's hands clenched in her lap. Her father had never told her about that meeting, had never mentioned any concerns about his work. But then again, David Bennett had been the kind of man who carried his burdens alone, who smiled at dinner while his world was falling apart. "What happened?" she asked. He was right. The company was a shell designed to look profitable while hiding massive debt and fraudulent research. If we had gone through with the acquisition, it would have cost us hundreds of millions and destroyed countless lives when their so-called miracle drug turned out to be nothing more than sugar water and false hope. Jonathan's green eyes fixed on Clara's face with an intensity that made her feel exposed and vulnerable. "Your father saved this company from a disaster that could have ruined us." "Then why?" Clara's voice broke slightly. "Why didn't anyone listen to him? Why didn't he get credit for stopping it?" The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Jonathan looked away, his jaw working as if he were fighting an internal battle between honesty and corporate diplomacy. "Because," he said finally, "some people didn't want that particular deal to fail. People who stood to make a significant amount of money from our misfortune. When your father brought his concerns to me, he also brought evidence that certain board members were being paid to push the acquisition through regardless of the risks." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. "You're saying my father discovered corruption. I'm saying your father was a man of integrity in a world that often punishes such qualities." Jonathan straightened, and Clara caught a glimpse of the steel that had made him one of the youngest CEOs in corporate history. 2 days after our meeting, he had his heart attack. Very convenient timing for some people. The implication hit Clara like a sledgehammer to the chest. You think they hurt him? I think your father was under an enormous amount of stress, facing threats and pressure that would have broken a lesser man. I think he died protecting the integrity of this company, and very few people even knew his name." Jonathan picked up the diary again, his fingers tracing the worn leather cover. "But his daughter has his eyes for detail, his instinct for truth, and apparently his courage in the face of danger." Clara's heart was racing so fast she felt dizzy. "The things I wrote about Westridge, you think they're connected to what happened to my father?" "I think," Jonathan said carefully, "that some people learned from their mistakes 6 years ago. This time they're being much more careful to cover their tracks. But they didn't count on David Bennett's daughter working in the same building, seeing patterns that others miss, asking questions that make powerful people uncomfortable." He opened the diary to the final page, and Clara's stomach dropped as she saw her own handwriting, staring back at her, the entry she had written in a moment of exhausted vulnerability, when the weight of her feelings had become too much to carry alone. "Which brings us," Jonathan said softly, "to the most interesting part of your observations." Clara closed her eyes, unable to look at the words she had written just 12 hours earlier. "The merger details keep me awake at night, but not as much as the thought of him. Jonathan Drake represents everything I should resist: power privilege, the kind of wealth that can buy silence and bury truth. But when I see him in the hallways, when I watch him in meetings, I don't see a corporate villain. I see a man carrying burdens he can't share, making decisions that could save or destroy thousands of lives. I see someone as isolated by his position as I am by mine. And God help me, I think I'm falling in love with him." "Miss Bennett." Jonathan's voice was gentler now, with an undertone that made Clara's pulse flutter. Look at me." She opened her eyes reluctantly, expecting to see disgust or amusement, or the kind of cold dismissal she had witnessed him use on subordinates who had crossed professional lines. Instead, she saw something that looked almost like relief. "Do you know what it's like," he asked quietly, "to spend every day surrounded by people who want something from you? Money favors access to power they can't earn on their own, to never be certain if someone's loyalty is real or simply the best performance they can manage." Clara shook her head, not trusting her voice to remain steady. "It's exhausting," Jonathan continued. "It makes you suspicious of every smile, every gesture of friendship, every word of praise. You start to believe that genuine human connection is a luxury you can't afford, that emotional honesty is a weakness that will be exploited the moment you let your guard down." He set the diary down and moved closer, close enough that Clara could see the flecks of gold in his green eyes, close enough to notice the small scar above his left eyebrow that spoke of a childhood that hadn't been entirely privileged. "And then," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "you find a diary that contains the most honest words anyone has spoken to you in years. Observations that show real intelligence and genuine concern for justice. Feelings that have nothing to do with what you can provide and everything to do with who you are when no one is watching." Clara's breath caught in her throat. "Mr. Drake, Jonathan," he corrected. "And I need you to understand something, Clara. The thoughts you wrote in this diary about the company, about the corruption you've witnessed about me, they're not the ramblings of a naive girl playing in a world she doesn't understand. They're the insights of someone who sees clearly in a place where most people choose blindness for the sake of convenience." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and touched her hand where it rested on the arm of her chair. His fingers were warm and slightly rough, and Clara felt electricity shoot up her arm at the contact. "Your father would be proud of you," Jonathan said, "and terrified for you. Because the people who killed him, and yes, Clara, I believe they killed him as surely as if they had put a gun to his head, those people are still here. They're still dangerous. And now they have a new problem to deal with." Clara's mind reeled with the implications. "You want me to help you expose them. I want you to be very, very careful," Jonathan said firmly. "Because if they discover that David Bennett's daughter is asking the same questions that got him killed, they won't hesitate to make sure history repeats itself." The weight of his words settled over Clara like a shroud. She thought of her father working late in his tiny cubicle following paper trails that led to powerful men with everything to lose. She thought of the heart attack that had struck him down in his prime, leaving behind questions that no one seemed interested in answering. And she thought of the man sitting across from her, the man she had foolishly allowed herself to care for, who was now offering her a choice between safety and justice, between anonymity and truth. "What if I'm not as brave as he was?" Clara asked, her voice small and uncertain. Jonathan's smile was soft and sad, and filled with an understanding that made Clara's heart ache. "Bravery isn't about not being afraid, Clara. It's about being terrified and choosing to do what's right anyway. And you've already proven you have that kind of courage. How? You wrote the truth in this diary, even knowing the risk if someone found it. You came to work today despite being afraid of what might happen. And you're sitting here having this conversation instead of running for the door." His fingers tightened slightly on her hand. "That's not the behavior of a coward." Clara looked down at their joined hands, marveling at how right it felt, despite how wrong it should be. 6 months ago, she had been just another faceless employee, grateful for a job that paid enough to keep her small apartment and put food on the table. Now she was sitting in the CEO's office holding his hand while he told her that her father had been murdered and that she might be next. The things I wrote about you, she said, suddenly heat rising in her cheeks. I never meant for you to see those. They were just feelings I couldn't keep to myself anymore. Were they true? Jonathan asked, his voice careful and neutral. Clara met his eyes, seeing her own vulnerability reflected in their green depths. Yes, every word. Then I'm glad I read them, he said simply, because I've been carrying similar feelings for months, and I was beginning to think I was losing my mind. The confession hit Clara like a physical shock. You... What? Jonathan's laugh was soft and slightly bitter. Did you think I didn't notice you, Clara? Did you think I missed the way you light up when you talk about a project you're passionate about? Or the way you go out of your way to help the junior staff, even when it means staying late to finish your own work? Did you think I didn't see the intelligence in your questions during meetings, or the way you blush when you catch me looking at you? Clara's face was burning now, but she couldn't look away from his intense gaze. I thought you saw me as just another employee. Forgettable. Replaceable. Nothing about you is forgettable, Jonathan said firmly. And that terrifies me more than any corporate conspiracy or boardroom battle ever could. Because caring about someone in this world, in this position, means giving your enemies a weapon they can use against you. The truth of his words settled between them like a challenge. Clara understood now why he had built walls around himself, why he maintained careful distance from everyone in his orbit. Caring was dangerous for someone in his position. Love was a luxury that could cost him everything. So what do we do? She asked. Jonathan was quiet for a long moment, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand, in a gesture so intimate it made Clara's breath hitch. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a decision that would change both their lives. We're careful, he said. We're smart. And we find out who killed your father before they decide you know too much to live. The silence that followed Jonathan's declaration stretched between them like a taut wire charged with the electricity of shared secrets and dangerous promises. Clara's hand still rested in his, their fingers intertwined in a gesture that felt both natural and revolutionary. She could hear her own heartbeat echoing in her ears, could feel the weight of her father's diary sitting on the desk like a loaded weapon waiting to be fired. How do we even begin? Clara whispered, her voice barely audible in the vast expanse of Jonathan's office. If these people were powerful enough to do what they did to my father, how can we possibly stand against them? Jonathan's grip on her hand tightened, and she saw something fierce and protective flash in his green eyes. Because this time they're not dealing with one isolated analyst who stumbled onto their scheme. This time they're dealing with someone who has access to every file, every meeting, every conversation that happens in this building. He paused, his jaw working as if he were wrestling with a decision that could damn them both. And because this time they're dealing with someone who has nothing left to lose. The weight of his words settled over Clara like a shroud. She studied his face, seeing past the carefully constructed mask of corporate authority to the man underneath a man who had been carrying burdens alone for far too long, who had built walls so high that he had forgotten what it felt like to let someone else share the load. What do you mean nothing left to lose? She asked. Jonathan released her hand and stood moving to the wall of windows that offered a commanding view of the city below. The morning rain had stopped, leaving the glass streaked with water that caught the pale sunlight and threw it back in fractured patterns across his face. My father built this company from nothing, he said, his voice carrying a weight that spoke of old wounds and deeper pain. He started with a single construction contract and a dream of creating something that would last beyond his lifetime. When he died 5 years ago, he left me more than just a business. He left me a legacy, a responsibility to the thousands of people whose livelihoods depend on Drake Industries. Clara watched him from her chair, sensing that she was about to hear something that very few people had ever been trusted with. But legacies can be twisted. Jonathan continued, his reflection ghost-like in the rain-streaked glass. They can be corrupted from within, turned into something unrecognizable by people who see opportunity where others see obligation. For the past 2 years, I've been fighting a war that most people don't even know exists, a battle for the soul of everything my father built. He turned back to face her, and Clara was struck by the exhaustion she saw in his features. It was the kind of bone-deep weariness that came from fighting battles on multiple fronts, never knowing which ally might turn out to be an enemy. The Westridge merger isn't just another acquisition, Clara. It's the culmination of a carefully orchestrated plan to gut Drake Industries from the inside out, to strip away everything that made this company worth preserving and leave behind nothing but profit margins and shareholder returns. Clara felt her stomach drop as the implications of his words began to sink in. You're saying the board members who pushed for my father to be silenced, they're the same ones behind Westridge? Some of them, Jonathan confirmed grimly. But the corruption runs deeper than I initially realized. Gerald Henderson, our CFO, has been feeding information to external parties for months. 3 board members have offshore accounts that receive regular payments from companies that don't officially exist. And our head of security has been conducting unauthorized surveillance on employees who ask too many questions. The picture Jonathan was painting was far worse than anything Clara had imagined when she wrote her observations in the diary. This wasn't just corporate malfeasance, this was a systematic dismantling of everything that made Drake Industries more than just another soulless corporation. But if you know all this, Clara said, why haven't you exposed them? Why haven't you fired the people you know are working against you? Jonathan's laugh was bitter and hollow. Because knowing something and being able to prove it are 2 very different things. And because the moment I make a move against them without ironclad evidence, they'll use their connections to destroy not just me, but everyone I care about. He moved back to his desk, picking up Clara's diary and holding it like it contained the secrets of the universe. But this changes everything. Your observations, your father's work, the patterns you've identified together, they form a map of the corruption that's been eating away at this company from the inside. Clara stood slowly, her legs still shaky from the revelations of the past hour. You want to use my father's research to expose them. I want to finish what your father started, Jonathan said, his voice carrying a determination that made Clara's pulse quicken. But I need your help to do it. You have access to areas of the company that I can't reach without raising suspicions. You can observe, listen, gather evidence without anyone questioning your presence. The magnitude of what he was asking hit Clara like a physical blow. He was asking her to step into her father's shoes, to walk the same dangerous path that had cost him his life. The smart thing to do would be to decline to ask for a transfer to another department, to disappear into the corporate machinery where she could blend in and be forgotten. But as she looked at Jonathan's face, saw the hope and desperation warring in his green eyes, Clara knew that she couldn't walk away. Not from him, not from the truth about her father's death, and not from the chance to honor David Bennett's memory by finishing the work he had died trying to complete. "What do you need me to do?" she asked. The relief that fastened over Jonathan's features was so profound that Clara felt her heart clench in her chest. "First, we need to be very careful about how we proceed. If Gerald or any of the others suspect that we're working together, they'll move against us before we can gather enough evidence to expose them." He moved to a filing cabinet behind his desk, withdrawing a thick folder that he placed carefully on the mahogany surface between them. This contains everything I've been able to compile over the past 2 years. Financial records, meeting transcripts, email communications that were accidentally copied to my account. It's not enough to build a case on its own, but combined with your observations. Clara approached the desk cautiously, as if the folder might explode at any moment. When she opened it, she was greeted by a maze of documents, photographs, and handwritten notes that spoke of countless hours spent piecing together a puzzle that seemed to grow more complex with each new piece. "My God," she breathed, scanning a photograph that showed Gerald Henderson meeting with a man she didn't recognize in what appeared to be a parking garage. "How long have you been investigating this?" "Since the day your father came to see me," Jonathan admitted. "His death convinced me that I was dealing with something far more dangerous than corporate politics as usual. But I've been operating alone, which means I've been limited in what I can discover without revealing my hand." Clara picked up a sheet of handwritten notes in Jonathan's precise script, noting the dates and times of suspicious meetings, unusual financial transfers, and personnel changes that seemed designed to remove anyone who might ask uncomfortable questions. "This is incredible work," she said, meaning it. "But you're right, it's all circumstantial. We need smoking gun evidence, something that directly links these people to the corruption." "Exactly. And I think I know where to find it." Jonathan moved around the desk to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "Gerald has been staying late every night for the past month working on something in his office that requires him to access files from the archive. According to security logs, he's been spending hours down there, but there's no record of what he's been retrieving." Clara felt a chill run down her spine. "You think he's destroying evidence? I think he's building a case for why the Westridge merger is not only necessary but urgent. Something that will convince the remaining honest board members that we have no choice but to move forward regardless of the risks." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "And I think he's getting ready to present that case at the emergency board meeting that's been called for Friday." "Emergency board meeting?" Clara's pulse quickened. "What emergency?" "That's what we need to find out," Jonathan said grimly. "Because in my experience, the only emergencies that require board meetings with 72 hours notice are the kind that someone has manufactured for their own purposes." Clara studied the documents spread across the desk, her mind racing as she tried to connect the pieces of the puzzle. If Gerald is building a false case for the merger, he'll need access to financial projections, market analysis, maybe even proprietary research data. All of that would be stored in the secure archives, which are located 3 floors below ground level, accessible only with executive clearance, and monitored by the same security team that's been conducting unauthorized surveillance on our employees," Jonathan finished. "It might as well be Fort Knox." But Clara was already shaking her head, a plan beginning to form in her mind. "Not necessarily. I still have my father's old access codes. They were never deactivated after he died, just transferred to inactive status. And I know the archive system better than most people because I spent 2 months down there last year helping to digitize old records." Jonathan stared at her with a mixture of admiration and terror. "Clara, if you're caught down there after hours, especially accessing files that are above your clearance level, then we'll make sure I'm not caught," Clara said with more confidence than she felt. "The security guards make their rounds every 2 hours. The cameras in the archive section have blind spots near the old filing cabinets, I remember, because we had to move some of the equipment to get better angles. And Gerald's been going down there around 8 o'clock every night, which means he'll be gone by 10 at the latest." The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Jonathan was studying her face as if trying to memorize every detail, and Clara realized that he was struggling with the same conflict that was tearing at her own heart, the knowledge that they were about to cross a line that would change everything between them, that would make them true partners in something that could either save them or destroy them both. "If we do this," Jonathan said quietly, "there's no going back. Once you step into that archive, once you start gathering evidence against people this powerful, you become a target, and I won't be able to protect you from everything they might do." Clara thought of her father alone in his cubicle, with his suspicions and his integrity trying to do the right thing in a world that punished such impulses. She thought of all the employees who depended on Drake Industries for their livelihoods, who deserved better than to have their company gutted by people who saw them as nothing more than expendable resources. And she thought of the man standing before her carrying burdens that would have crushed a lesser person fighting a war that he couldn't win alone. "I'm already a target," she said simply. "The moment I wrote those observations in my diary, the moment I started asking questions, I became someone they need to worry about. At least this way, I'm a target with a purpose." Jonathan's smile was soft and sad, and filled with an emotion that made Clara's chest tight with longing. "Your father would be so proud of you," he said, "and so terrified. Then we'll have to make sure we don't give him any more reasons to be terrified than we absolutely have to." Clara closed the folder and looked directly into Jonathan's eyes. "What time should I meet you tonight?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that went far beyond their planned investigation. They both knew that once they took this step, once they became true conspirators in something this dangerous, the careful professional distance they had maintained would be impossible to sustain. "Midnight," Jonathan said after a long moment. "I'll disable the security cameras on the executive floors and create a diversion that will keep the guards busy on the upper levels. That should give you a clear path to the archives and at least an hour to find what we need." Clara nodded, trying to project a confidence she didn't entirely feel. "And if Gerald shows up unexpectedly—" "He won't," Jonathan said with grim certainty. "He'll be at the Metropolitan Club tonight, attending a private dinner with several of our board members and some very interesting guests from Westridge Corporation. I made sure of it." The implications of that statement made Clara's head spin. "You're already watching them." "I've been watching them for months," Jonathan admitted. "The difference is that now I have someone I can trust to help me act on what I've learned." The word trust hung between them like a bridge across a chasm neither of them had been able to cross alone. Clara felt the weight of it, the responsibility, and the gift that Jonathan was offering her. In his world, trust was a currency more valuable than money, more dangerous than any weapon. "I should get back to my desk," Clara said reluctantly, though every instinct screamed at her to stay in this office in this moment, where they could speak freely and honestly about the feelings that had been building between them for months. "People will start to wonder where I am." Jonathan nodded, but his eyes never left her face. "Clara," he said, as she moved toward the door, "be careful today. Watch who you talk to, what you say, who might be listening. And if anything feels wrong, anything at all, you call me immediately." She paused with her hand on the door handle, looking back at him, standing behind his massive desk, with her father's diary still clutched in his hands. "What about the diary? What if someone asks why you called me up here?" "I'll tell them I was returning personal property that was found in a conference room," Jonathan said. "And I'll remind them that Drake Industries has always valued the privacy and dignity of our employees." Clara almost smiled at that. Even the employees who write inappropriate things about their CEO, especially those employees, Jonathan said, and his voice carried a warmth that made Clara's heart skip a beat. "Because those employees are brave enough to write the truth even when it's dangerous." She left his office in a daze, clutching her father's diary against her chest like a shield. The executive floor seemed different now, charged with new meaning, and hidden dangers that she was only beginning to understand. Victoria looked up as Clara passed her desk, and for a moment Clara wondered if the receptionist could somehow sense that everything had changed in the past hour. The elevator ride back to her floor felt like a descent from one world into another. On the 23rd floor, she was Clara Bennett, the woman who had shared secrets and made dangerous promises with the most powerful man in the building. On the 15th floor, she was just another administrative assistant, invisible and unremarkable, exactly the kind of person who could move through the building without attracting attention. Her cubicle felt impossibly small after the vast expanse of Jonathan's office. Clara sat at her desk and stared at her computer screen, trying to process everything that had happened. Everything that was about to happen. In 12 hours, she would be breaking into the company archives, stealing evidence that could expose a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of Drake Industries. And she would be doing it for a man she was falling in love with, a man who had just trusted her with secrets that could destroy them both. Clara, the sharp voice of her supervisor, Margaret Walsh, cut through her thoughts like a blade. Where have you been? The quarterly reports were supposed to be on Mr. Drake's desk an hour ago. Clara looked up at Margaret's pinched face, noting the stress lines that had deepened over the past few months as the pressure from upper management had increased. I'm sorry, Mrs. Walsh. There was a mix-up with the files. Mr. Drake called me to his office to discuss the situation. Margaret's expression shifted from irritation to curiosity. He called you to his office personally. He wanted to discuss some discrepancies in the numbers, Clara said carefully, sticking as close to the truth as possible. I'll have the corrected reports to him by end of business today. It was a lie, but a necessary one. Clara had no idea where the actual quarterly reports were, and at this point they seemed almost insignificant compared to the larger conspiracy that was unfolding around them. But Margaret didn't need to know that. Well, see that you do, Margaret said, though her tone had lost some of its edge. And Clara, whatever Mr. Drake discussed with you, I assume it goes without saying that such conversations are confidential. Clara nodded, understanding the unspoken message. In Margaret's world, being called to the CEO's office was either a sign of great favor or impending disaster, and either way, it was something to be handled with extreme discretion. The rest of the day passed in a blur of routine tasks and mounting tension. Clara found herself watching the clock, obsessively counting down the hours until midnight, while trying to maintain the appearance of normalcy. She attended meetings, answered emails, and helped train a new intern, all while her mind raced with plans and contingencies for the night ahead. At lunch, she sat alone in the company cafeteria, picking at a sandwich she couldn't taste while observing the employees around her. How many of them knew about the corruption that was eating away at the company from within? How many were simply trying to do their jobs while more powerful people played games with their livelihoods? Mind if I sit? Clara looked up to find David Kim, one of the junior analysts from the financial department, standing beside her table with a tray of food and an uncertain expression. She had worked with David on several projects over the past few months and had always found him to be intelligent, honest, and refreshingly free of the political games that seemed to consume so many of their colleagues. Of course, Clara said, gesturing to the empty chair across from her. How are the Henderson projections coming along? David's expression darkened as he sat down. That's actually what I wanted to talk to you about. I've been running the numbers for the Westridge analysis, and something isn't adding up. Clara's pulse quickened, but she kept her expression neutral. What kind of something? The revenue projections Gerald gave me don't match the source data from Westridge's financial statements. Not even close. David leaned forward, lowering his voice. It's like someone took the real numbers and then optimized them to support a predetermined conclusion. The confirmation of her suspicions hit Clara like a physical blow, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Have you mentioned this to Gerald?" "I tried. He told me that the discrepancies were due to proprietary adjustments based on insider knowledge of Westridge's upcoming product launches." David's expression was troubled. "But Clara, I've been doing financial analysis for 3 years, and I've never seen adjustments that dramatic without detailed documentation to support them." Clara set down her sandwich, her appetite completely gone. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know," David admitted. "Gerald's my boss, and he's made it clear that questioning his methods isn't appreciated. But if I sign off on these projections knowing they're flawed, you could be complicit in a decision that could cost the company millions," Clara finished. "Not to mention your professional integrity." David nodded miserably. "Exactly. But if I refuse to approve the numbers, Gerald will make sure I'm transferred to some dead-end position where I'll spend the rest of my career counting paper clips." Clara studied David's face, seeing the same conflict that had probably tormented her father 6 years ago. The choice between doing what was right and protecting your own career was never an easy one, especially when you had student loans and rent to pay. "David," she said carefully, "what if I told you that you're not the only one who's noticed problems with the Westridge deal?" His eyes widened slightly. "You mean there are others?" "I mean that sometimes the right thing to do is also the smart thing to do, even when it doesn't feel that way." Clara made a decision that she hoped she wouldn't regret. "If you're serious about wanting to do something about those numbers, meet me at Murphy's bar after work. 7 o'clock. Come alone and don't mention this conversation to anyone." David stared at her for a long moment, and Clara could see him weighing the risks and possibilities. Finally, he nodded slowly. "I'll be there." The rest of the afternoon crawled by with agonizing slowness. Clara tried to focus on her work, but her mind kept racing between the upcoming meeting with David and the midnight mission that would determine the fate of everything they were fighting for. By the time 5 o'clock arrived, she felt like her nerves were stretched to the breaking point. Murphy's bar was exactly the kind of place where corporate conspiracies should be discussed, dim, crowded, and loud enough that conversations couldn't be overheard from neighboring tables. Clara arrived early and chose a booth in the back corner, positioning herself where she could watch the entrance while remaining relatively inconspicuous. David arrived precisely at 7, looking nervous but determined. He slid into the booth across from Clara and immediately leaned forward, his voice barely audible above the ambient noise of the bar. "I've been thinking about what you said all afternoon," he began. "And I keep coming back to the same conclusion. If I don't do something about those numbers, I'm going to regret it for the rest of my career." "Even if it means putting yourself at risk?" Clara asked. "Especially if it means putting myself at risk," David said with surprising firmness. "My father always told me that the measure of a man isn't what he does when it's easy, but what he does when it's hard." Clara felt a pang of recognition at those words. Her own father had said something similar many times, usually when he was explaining why he couldn't ignore problems that other people preferred to overlook. "David," she said carefully, "what I'm about to tell you could put both of us in serious danger. Are you sure you want to hear it?" He nodded without hesitation. "I'm sure." Over the next hour, Clara laid out everything she knew about the corruption at Drake Industries, carefully omitting any mention of her relationship with Jonathan, while focusing on the facts that David needed to understand. She watched his expression shift from surprise to anger to grim determination as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. "Jesus," he breathed when she finished. "No wonder my numbers didn't add up. They're not trying to make a smart business decision, they're trying to orchestrate a controlled demolition." Which is why we need evidence, Clara said. Real, undeniable proof that will stand up in court, and in the media. David was quiet for a long moment, staring into his beer as if it might contain answers to questions he was afraid to ask. What do you need me to do? Keep doing your job exactly as you have been. Don't change anything about your routine or your behavior. But if you notice anything else unusual, anything at all, I need you to document it carefully and discreetly. And you, David asked, what are you going to be doing? Clara met his eyes steadily. Whatever it takes to finish what my father started. They parted ways outside the bar, David heading home to his apartment, while Clara walked slowly back toward the Drake Industries building. The night air was cool and crisp, carrying the promise of winter and the scent of rain. As she walked, Clara thought about the path that had brought her to this moment, a path that had begun with her father's death and led through months of careful observation, dangerous discoveries, and the most unlikely romance of her life. In 5 hours, she would be breaking into the company archives, stealing evidence that could expose a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of corporate power. If she succeeded, she might help save Drake Industries from the people who were trying to destroy it from within. If she failed, she would probably follow her father to an early grave. But for the first time since David Bennett's funeral, Clara felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. The fear was still there, cold and sharp in her chest, but it was overwhelmed by something stronger, a sense of purpose that burned like a flame in the darkness. At 11:30, Clara was back in the Drake Industries building, having used her keycard to enter through the employee parking garage. The building felt different at night, emptier and more menacing, filled with shadows that seemed to move when she wasn't looking directly at them. She made her way to the stairwell, avoiding the elevators that would leave an electronic record of her presence. The descent to the archive level felt like a journey into the bowels of the earth. 3 floors below ground, the air was cooler and carried the musty scent of old paper and forgotten secrets. Clara's footsteps echoed hollowly in the concrete stairwell, each sound seeming to announce her presence to whatever ghosts might be lurking in the darkness. At exactly midnight, she reached the archive level and carefully opened the heavy steel door that led into the storage area. The hallway beyond was dimly lit by emergency lighting, casting everything in an eerie red glow that made the shadows seem deeper and more threatening. Clara activated her father's old access codes, holding her breath as the system processed her credentials. For a moment, she was certain that alarms would start blaring, that security guards would come running, that her mission would end before it had truly begun. Instead, the system accepted the codes with a soft electronic chirp, and the archive door swung open with a whisper of recycled air. She was in. The archive stretched before Clara like a cathedral of secrets, its towering shelves disappearing into shadows that seemed to swallow the weak emergency lighting. The air was thick with the smell of aging paper and electronic equipment, punctuated by the distant hum of climate control systems working to preserve decades of corporate memory. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs as she stepped into the labyrinth of filing cabinets and storage units, each one potentially containing the evidence that could save or damn them all. She had studied the layout during her time helping with the digitization project, but the archive felt different in the red-tinged darkness, larger, more maze-like, filled with corners where danger could hide. Clara pulled out her phone and activated the flashlight app, keeping the beam low and directed away from the security cameras she knew were mounted at regular intervals throughout the space. The section Gerald had been accessing was located in the northwest corner, where the oldest financial records were stored, alongside proprietary research files and legal documents that required the highest level of security clearance. Clara made her way carefully through the narrow aisles, stepping around boxes of archived correspondence and ducking under low-hanging cable runs that connected the various storage systems. As she moved deeper into the archive, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Every shadow seemed to shift with malevolent purpose. Every creak of the building's infrastructure sounded like footsteps following her path. She paused frequently to listen, straining her ears for any sound that might indicate she wasn't alone in the underground fortress of corporate secrets. The filing system in the northwest section was organized by date and security classification, with the most sensitive materials locked behind additional access controls that required both keycard authentication and biometric verification. Clara approached the central terminal that controlled access to the secure files, her father's access codes burning in her memory like a prayer she was afraid to utter. The terminal's screen flickered to life as she approached, casting her face in pale blue light that made her look ghostly in the reflective surface of a nearby filing cabinet. Clara entered her father's employee ID, followed by the access codes she had memorized from watching him work in his home office during the final months of his life. The system processed her request with agonizing slowness, each second stretching into an eternity as Clara waited to see whether her father's digital ghost would grant her passage into the sanctum of Drake Industries' most carefully guarded secrets. Access granted. Flashed across the screen, and Clara released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The heavy locks on the secure storage area disengaged with a series of mechanical clicks that seemed impossibly loud in the silence of the archive. Clara pulled open the reinforced door and stepped into a smaller chamber lined with climate-controlled cabinets that contained the financial and legal documents that could make or break the company's future. She began her search methodically, starting with the files that Gerald would have needed for his analysis of the Westridge merger. The beam of her phone's flashlight revealed folder after folder of contracts, financial projections, and due diligence reports that painted a picture of a company desperate enough to consider almost any option for growth. But as Clara dug deeper into the files, she began to see patterns that made her stomach turn with their implications. The first red flag was a series of shell companies that appeared in multiple documents, but had no clear business purpose or ownership structure. These entities seemed to exist solely to facilitate financial transfers that obscured the true source and destination of millions of dollars. Clara photographed each document with her phone, building a digital trail of evidence that would be impossible to dismiss or explain away. The second discovery was even more damning. A set of communication records that showed regular contact between Gerald Henderson and executives at Westridge Corporation, dating back 18 months long, before any official merger discussions had begun. The emails were carefully worded to avoid explicit discussion of illegal activity, but their implications were clear to anyone who understood the language of corporate conspiracy. But it was the third discovery that made Clara's blood run cold. Hidden behind a false back in one of the filing cabinets, she found a manila envelope that contained copies of medical records, insurance claims, and death certificates for 5 Drake Industries employees who had died under suspicious circumstances over the past 6 years. Her father's name was at the top of the list. Clara's hands shook as she photographed each document, the flash of her phone's camera creating brief moments of stark clarity in the red-lit darkness. The pattern was unmistakable. Each of the deceased employees had been working on projects that involved financial irregularities or questionable business practices. Each had died of seemingly natural causes that could have been induced by someone with the right knowledge and resources. And each had left behind families who had received generous settlement packages that included non-disclosure agreements, preventing them from discussing the circumstances of their loved one's death. "My God," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible in the silence of the archive. "They killed all of them." The sound of her own voice in the darkness startled her back to awareness of her surroundings. She had been so absorbed in documenting the evidence that she had lost track of time, and a glance at her phone showed that she had been in the archive for nearly an hour. The security guards would be making their next round soon, and she needed to finish her search and get out before they discovered her presence. Clara forced herself to focus, pushing through the remaining files with ruthless efficiency. She found financial projections that had been deliberately falsified to make Westridge appear more profitable than it actually was, legal opinions that had been purchased rather than earned, and correspondence that revealed the true scope of the conspiracy to gut Drake Industries from within. But the most valuable discovery came in the final cabinet. She searched a folder labeled Project Resurrection that contained the complete blueprint for the corporate takeover that Gerald and his co-conspirators were orchestrating. The plan was breathtaking in its scope and audacity, designed to use the Westridge merger as a Trojan horse that would allow external investors to gain control of Drake Industries' most valuable assets, while leaving the company saddled with debt and legal liability. The folder also contained a list of targets, employees who had been identified as potential threats to the plan, and were marked for elimination through various means. Clara's name appeared near the bottom of the list, along with a notation that made her blood freeze in her veins. David Bennett's daughter. High priority removal. Natural causes preferred. Clara photographed the entire folder with trembling hands, documenting evidence that could expose the conspiracy and save countless lives. But as she worked, she became increasingly aware of a sound that made her heart skip a beat, the distant hum of an elevator descending toward the archive level. Someone was coming. Clara quickly closed the filing cabinets and secured the storage area, her movements becoming frantic as the elevator continued its descent. She had perhaps 2 minutes before whoever was coming would reach the archive level, and she needed to find a place to hide before they discovered her presence. The archive was vast, but most of its hiding places would be obvious to anyone conducting a systematic search. Clara made a desperate calculation and ran toward the oldest section of the storage area, where boxes of paper records from the company's earliest days were stacked floor to ceiling, in a maze of narrow aisles that hadn't been fully mapped by the security system. She had just squeezed herself behind a wall of banker's boxes when she heard the archive door open with a soft, pneumatic hiss. Multiple sets of footsteps entered the space, their voices carrying clearly in the still air. "Are you certain the system registered an access?" The voice belonged to Gerald Henderson, his tone sharp with suspicion and barely controlled anxiety. "Positive," replied a second voice that Clara recognized as belonging to Marcus Webb, the head of security who had been conducting unauthorized surveillance on employees. David Bennett's old access codes were used at 12:03 a.m. The system logged a successful authentication and full archive access. Clara pressed herself deeper into the shadows between the storage boxes, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain they would hear it. The beam of a powerful flashlight swept across the aisle where she was hiding, missing her at mere inches as it probed the darkness for signs of intrusion. "That's impossible," Gerald said, his voice moving closer to Clara's hiding place. "David Bennett has been dead for 3 years. His access should have been permanently revoked." "Should have been," Marcus agreed grimly. "But someone in IT was sloppy with the deactivation process. The codes were moved to inactive status but never fully purged from the system. Anyone who knew them could still use them to gain access." The implications of their conversation hit Clara like a physical blow. They weren't just discovering her presence in the archive, they were revealing that they had known about her father's continued system access all along, that they had been monitoring it as a potential security risk, which meant they had probably been watching her for weeks, waiting for her to make exactly the kind of mistake she had just made. The question, Gerald continued, is who has those codes now. David was paranoid about security. He never would have shared them with anyone while he was alive. Unless he passed them on to someone he trusted, Marcus suggested. Someone who might have access to his personal effects, his computer files, his daughter. Gerald's voice was cold with realization. Clara Bennett. She's been asking questions, making observations that are uncomfortably similar to her father's final reports. And she had access to his home office after he died. Clara bit her lip to keep from gasping as the pieces fell into place. They had been watching her, studying her patterns, waiting for her to reveal herself as a threat that needed to be eliminated. Her mission to gather evidence had walked directly into a trap that had been set months in advance. Find her, Gerald ordered. She's here somewhere and she's seen too much to be allowed to leave. The sound of footsteps split apart as the two men began a systematic search of the archive. Clara could hear them moving through the aisles, opening cabinets and checking behind storage units with methodical precision. It was only a matter of time before they reached her hiding place, and when they did, she would face the same fate that had befallen her father and the other employees who had gotten too close to the truth. But as Clara crouched in the darkness, surrounded by decades of corporate history, an idea began to form in her mind. The archive wasn't just a storage facility. It was also connected to the building's main computer network, with terminals and communication equipment that could be used to transmit information to the outside world. If she could reach one of those terminals without being caught, she might be able to send the evidence she had gathered to Jonathan, ensuring that the truth would survive, even if she didn't. The nearest network terminal was located in the central processing area about 50 feet from her current hiding place, but separated by several open aisles that would leave her exposed to discovery. Clara would have to time her movement perfectly, waiting for both searchers to be far enough away that she could make the dash without being seen. She listened carefully to the sounds of their search, mapping their positions by the shuffle of their footsteps and the occasional clatter of disturbed storage materials. Gerald was working his way through the legal documents section on the far side of the archive, while Marcus was systematically checking the personnel files closer to Clara's location. If she moved now during the brief window when both men were occupied with their searches, she might be able to reach the terminal undetected. Clara took a deep breath and prepared to run, but as she shifted her weight to spring from her hiding place, her foot caught on the corner of a storage box, sending it tumbling to the floor, with a crash that echoed through the archive like a gunshot. The footsteps stopped immediately. Northeast section. Marcus called out, his voice tight with excitement. I heard something near the old personnel records. Clara abandoned stealth for speed, sprinting toward the central processing area as the beams of powerful flashlights converged on her former hiding place. She could hear Gerald and Marcus shouting to each other as they coordinated their pursuit, their footsteps pounding against the concrete floor as they gave chase. The network terminal was ancient by modern standards, its cathode ray tube monitor flickering to life as Clara frantically entered her access credentials. The system was painfully slow to respond, each command taking precious seconds to process, while the sounds of pursuit grew closer behind her. Clara opened her phone and began uploading the photographs she had taken, sending them to an encrypted email account that Jonathan had set up for secure communications. The files were large, and the archive's network connection was limited, causing the upload to crawl forward at an agonizing pace that made Clara want to scream with frustration. There! Gerald's voice cut through the darkness like a blade. Central processing area, cut off her escape routes. Clara could see the beams of their flashlights playing across the walls around her as they closed in from multiple directions. The upload was only 60% complete, but she was running out of time to finish the transmission before they reached her position. A hand grabbed her shoulder and spun her around, and Clara found herself face to face with Marcus Webb. The head of security was a large man with the kind of build that spoke of years spent in law enforcement or military service, and his expression was cold with professional menace. "Clara Bennett," he said, his voice carrying no trace of surprise or emotion. "You've been a very difficult young woman to keep track of." "Let me go," Clara said, trying to project a confidence she didn't feel. "I haven't done anything wrong." Marcus's laugh was harsh and humorless. "Breaking into a secure archive after hours using stolen access codes isn't wrong. Photographing confidential corporate documents isn't wrong. I'm afraid your definition of acceptable behavior differs significantly from mine." Gerald appeared at Marcus's shoulder, his face flushed with exertion and anger. "What did you find?" he demanded, looking from Clara to the terminal, where her phone was still connected, the upload slowly continuing in the background. "Evidence," Clara said, lifting her chin defiantly. "Evidence of murder conspiracy, fraud, and corporate espionage. Evidence that proves you and your friends have been systematically destroying Drake Industries from within while murdering anyone who gets in your way." Gerald's expression shifted from anger to something that might have been amusement. "Evidence, my dear girl. You have photographs of documents that will be explained away as routine corporate communications and standard financial projections, even if anyone believed your wild conspiracy theories, which they won't. You have nothing that would stand up in a court of law." "I have enough," Clara said, glancing at the terminal, where the upload had reached 80% completion. "I have enough to ask questions that you won't be able to answer, to demand investigations that you won't be able to stop." "No," Gerald said quietly. "You don't. Because in about 5 minutes, you're going to suffer a tragic accident down here in the archives. A slip and fall, perhaps, or maybe an unfortunate encounter with some of the heavier storage equipment. These underground facilities can be so dangerous for young women working alone at night." The casual way he discussed her murder made Clara's blood run cold, but she forced herself to stand her ground. "Jonathan knows I'm here," she lied. "If something happens to me, he'll know exactly who's responsible." Gerald and Marcus exchanged a look that was loaded with meaning, and Clara realized with growing horror that her bluff had backfired spectacularly. "Jonathan Drake," Gerald said slowly, "is about to have much bigger problems to worry about. You see, tomorrow morning the board will be presented with evidence of his gross misconduct and financial impropriety. Evidence that will force his immediate resignation and clear the way for new leadership that's more amenable to the Westridge merger." "What evidence?" Clara demanded. "You can't just manufacture—" "Oh, but we can," Gerald interrupted. "And we have. Falsified expense reports showing massive personal expenditures charged to the company. Email communications indicating kickbacks from vendors and suppliers. And most damaging of all, evidence of his inappropriate relationship with a subordinate employee. Someone he's been using his position to coerce and manipulate." The pieces fell into place with horrible clarity, and Clara realized that her relationship with Jonathan, barely begun and carefully hidden, had been weaponized against them both. "You've been watching us." "We've been watching everyone," Marcus confirmed. "Every email, every phone call, every private conversation in supposedly secure locations. Did you really think the CEO's office was immune to surveillance?" Clara thought of the moments she and Jonathan had shared in his office, the careful words and cautious touches that had felt so private and meaningful. The knowledge that those intimate moments had been recorded and would be used to destroy them both made her feel sick with violation and rage. The diary was bait, she realized. "You wanted me to find it, wanted me to react, wanted to create evidence of our relationship." "The diary was a happy accident," Gerald admitted. "But yes, once we discovered it, we realized it could be very useful in building a case against Jonathan. A naive young employee seduced by her powerful boss, manipulated into conducting industrial espionage on his behalf. It's a story the media will find irresistible. The upload had reached 95% completion, but Clara knew she would never live to see it finished. Gerald and Marcus were positioning themselves to cut off any escape route, and she could see in their eyes the cold calculation of professional killers preparing to eliminate a threat. But as despair began to settle over her like a shroud, Clara heard something that made her heart leap with desperate hope. The distant sound of elevator doors opening, followed by footsteps that were too light and quick to belong to Gerald or Marcus. Clara. Jonathan's voice echoed through the archive, carrying a note of panic that spoke of someone who had arrived to find his worst fears confirmed. "Clara, where are you?" Gerald cursed under his breath and gestured for Marcus to move toward the elevator. "Take care of him," he ordered. "Make it look like they killed each other, a lover's quarrel that turned violent." But Marcus was shaking his head, his expression troubled. "Jonathan Drake isn't some anonymous employee we can disappear without questions. If he dies tonight, especially under these circumstances, there will be investigations we can't control." "Then we improvise," Gerald snapped. "But neither of them leaves this building alive." Jonathan's footsteps were getting closer, and Clara realized that he was walking into the same trap that had snared her. She had to warn him, had to find a way to turn the situation to their advantage before Gerald and Marcus could implement whatever backup plan they were formulating. "Jonathan," Clara called out, her voice carrying clearly through the archive. "It's a trap. Gerald and Marcus are here. They have evidence against you." Her warning was met by a moment of silence, followed by the sound of running footsteps as Jonathan changed direction, no longer approaching openly, but moving with the stealth of someone who understood the danger he faced. Gerald's face contorted with rage at Clara's defiance. "You stupid little girl," he snarled, raising his hand as if to strike her. "You've just signed both your death warrants." But before he could follow through on his threat, the lights in the archive suddenly blazed to life, transforming the red-tinged darkness into harsh white brilliance that left everyone temporarily blinded. The upload on Clara's phone completed with a soft chime that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden illumination. "Federal agents!" a voice boomed over the archive's public address system. "This building is surrounded. Drop any weapons and place your hands where we can see them." Gerald and Marcus froze, their expressions shifting from predatory confidence to confused alarm as they tried to process this unexpected development. Clara was equally stunned, having no idea how federal agents had become involved in what she had thought was a private corporate conspiracy. The answer came from Jonathan himself, who emerged from behind a bank of storage cabinets with his hands raised, but his expression grimly satisfied. "I called them 2 hours ago," he explained, his eyes fixed on Gerald and Marcus. "The FBI has been investigating Drake Industries for months as part of a larger investigation into corporate fraud and murder for hire. All they needed was evidence, and Clara just provided it." Clara looked at her phone, where a confirmation message showed that her photographs had been successfully transmitted not just to Jonathan's encrypted account, but to a secure server maintained by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The evidence she had gathered, the financial records, the communication logs, the death certificates, and most importantly, the complete Project Resurrection blueprint, was now in the hands of federal investigators who had the power to bring down the entire conspiracy. "You set us up," Gerald said, his voice hollow with the realization that he had been outmaneuvered. "All of this was planned." "Not all of it," Jonathan admitted, moving closer to Clara, but keeping his hands visible as federal agents began flooding into the archive. "I had hoped we could gather evidence without putting Clara in danger. But when I realized that you were monitoring the building's security systems, I knew we needed backup." Marcus was backing away, his hand moving toward what Clara now realized was a concealed weapon. "This isn't over," he said, his voice tight with desperation. "You have no idea how deep this goes, how many people are involved. Killing us won't stop what's coming." "Maybe not," Jonathan said calmly. "But it will stop you from hurting anyone else." The standoff that followed lasted only seconds before federal agents surrounded Marcus and Gerald, forcing them to surrender without violence. Clara watched in a daze as the two men who had orchestrated her father's murder and planned her own death were handcuffed and led away, their faces masks of defeat and rage. As the immediate danger passed, Clara felt her legs give way beneath her. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the night's ordeal was fading, leaving behind exhaustion and emotional shock that threatened to overwhelm her completely. Jonathan was beside her in an instant, his arms around her as she struggled to process everything that had happened. "It's over," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "It's finally over." But even as Clara allowed herself to collapse into his embrace, she knew that Jonathan was wrong. This wasn't the end of their story. It was just the beginning. The evidence they had gathered would take months to fully analyze, and the conspiracy they had exposed reached into levels of corporate and political power that neither of them fully understood. The real battle was just beginning, and Clara had no idea whether they were strong enough to survive what was coming next. The federal agents who flooded the archive moved with the precision of a military operation. Their voices crisp and professional as they secured the scene and began cataloging evidence. Clara found herself sitting on a metal folding chair that someone had brought down from the upper levels, wrapped in a blanket that smelled of government-issue wool and industrial detergent. The harsh, fluorescent lights that had saved her life now felt punishing, revealing every detail of the underground chamber where her father's killers had finally been brought to justice. Special Agent Rebecca Martinez approached with a steaming cup of coffee and the kind of patient expression that suggested she had conducted thousands of interviews with traumatized witnesses. She was a woman in her early 40s, with graying hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that missed nothing, including the way Jonathan hovered protectively near Clara's chair, despite having his own statement to give. "Miss Bennett," Agent Martinez said, settling into a chair across from Clara with deliberate casualness. "I know this has been an overwhelming night, but I need to ask you some questions while the details are still fresh in your memory." Clara nodded, though her hands trembled slightly as she lifted the coffee cup to her lips. The liquid was bitter and too hot, but it helped ground her in the present moment, when her mind kept drifting back to the moment Gerald had casually discussed her murder, as if it were a routine business decision. "Take your time." Agent Martinez continued, pulling out a digital recorder and setting it on the table between them. "We've been investigating this conspiracy for 8 months, but until tonight, we didn't have enough evidence to move forward with arrests. The documents you photographed have provided the missing pieces we needed to build prosecutable cases." 8 months. Clara's voice was hoarse from stress and exhaustion. "You mean you knew about my father's murder all along?" Agent Martinez's expression softened slightly. "We suspected. David Bennett's death was one of several that caught our attention, along with the deaths of 4 other Drake Industries employees over the past 6 years. All of them had been working on projects that involved financial irregularities, and all of them died of apparent natural causes that could have been induced through various means." The confirmation of her worst fears should have brought Clara some measure of satisfaction, but instead she felt only a hollow ache where her anger had been. "Why didn't you do something sooner? Why did you let them kill him?" "Because suspicion isn't evidence," Agent Martinez replied gently. "And because the people we were investigating are exceptionally skilled at covering their tracks. We needed someone on the inside, someone they trusted, to make a mistake that would give us the proof we needed. Clara set down her coffee cup with enough force to slosh liquid onto the metal table. You're saying you used me as bait, that you knew I was in danger, and you let me walk into that archive anyway. We didn't know about tonight's operation until Mr. Drake contacted us, Agent Martinez said firmly. And if we had known, we would have tried to stop you. What you did was incredibly brave, Miss Bennett, but it was also incredibly reckless. If Mr. Drake hadn't been monitoring the building's security systems and realized you were in trouble. She didn't need to finish the sentence. Clara understood perfectly well how close she had come to joining her father in whatever unmarked grave Gerald and his associates had planned for her. Jonathan moved closer, his presence a steadying force in the chaos of federal agents and evidence technicians that surrounded them. Clara didn't know about the FBI investigation, he said, his voice carrying a protective edge that made Agent Martinez raise an eyebrow. She was acting on her own initiative, trying to find evidence to expose the corruption she had witnessed. And you, Mr. Drake? When did you first contact federal authorities about your suspicions? Jonathan's jaw tightened, and Clara could see him weighing his words carefully. 3 months ago. I had been conducting my own investigation for nearly 2 years, but I realized I was in over my head when employees started dying. I needed help from people with resources and authority total that I didn't have. Agent Martinez made a note on her tablet, her expression revealing nothing about whether she found Jonathan's timeline credible. And yet, you allowed Miss Bennett to place herself in danger tonight, rather than sharing what you knew about the federal investigation. I tried to stop her, Jonathan said quietly. But Clara she's like her father. When she sees injustice, she can't walk away from it, even when walking away would be the smart thing to do. Clara felt a flush of warmth at his words, mixed with frustration at the way he and Agent Martinez were discussing her as if she weren't sitting right there. I can make my own decisions about what risks to take, she said sharply. And I don't regret anything I did tonight, even if it was dangerous. Agent Martinez studied Clara's face for a long moment, and Clara had the uncomfortable feeling that the agent was seeing far more than she was comfortable revealing. You're right, Miss Bennett. You did make your own decisions, and those decisions have probably saved hundreds of jobs and prevented millions of dollars in fraud. But I need you to understand that this investigation is far from over, and the danger to both of you may actually be increasing rather than decreasing. The words hit Clara like ice water, washing away the relief she had been feeling since Gerald and Marcus were led away in handcuffs. What do you mean? I mean that Gerald Henderson and Marcus Webb were middle management in this conspiracy, not the people at the top. The evidence you gathered tonight implicates several board members, executives at Westridge Corporation, and at least 3 politicians who have been receiving payments in exchange for favorable regulatory decisions. These are powerful people with significant resources and very little to lose if this conspiracy becomes public. Jonathan's face had gone pale at the agent's words. You're saying they might try to eliminate us before we can testify. I'm saying that you've both become high-value targets for people who have already demonstrated their willingness to commit murder to protect their interests, Agent Martinez replied bluntly. Which is why the FBI is prepared to offer you both places in the federal witness protection program until this matter is resolved. The suggestion hit Clara like a physical blow. Witness protection meant disappearing, leaving behind everything and everyone she had ever known, becoming someone else in some anonymous city where she would spend the rest of her life looking over her shoulder. It meant giving up any chance of a normal relationship with Jonathan, of building the life together that had seemed tantalizingly possible just hours earlier. For how long? Clara asked, though she was afraid she already knew the answer. That depends on how quickly we can build cases against the remaining conspirators and how willing they are to cooperate, Agent Martinez said. It could be months, it could be years, and there's always the possibility that some of them might escape prosecution entirely, which would mean the threat to your safety could be permanent. Clara looked at Jonathan, seeing her own despair reflected in his green eyes. They had fought so hard to expose the truth, had risked everything to bring her father's killers to justice, only to discover that their victory came with a price that might cost them their future together. There has to be another way, Jonathan said, his voice tight with desperation. Increased security, private protection, something that doesn't require us to disappear completely. Agent Martinez shook her head grimly. Mr. Drake, with respect, you have no idea what you're dealing with. The people at the top of this conspiracy have connections in law enforcement, in the military, in intelligence agencies. They have access to resources and capabilities that make private security look like mall cops with flashlights. She leaned forward, her expression intense. 6 months ago, a federal prosecutor in Chicago, who was investigating similar corporate fraud, died in a car accident that looked completely random until our accident reconstruction team found evidence that his brake lines had been severed. 2 months ago, a journalist in Miami who was preparing an exposé on shell company money laundering suffered a heart attack at age 35 despite having no history of cardiac problems. These people don't make threats, Miss Bennett. They don't send warnings. They simply eliminate problems before those problems can become unmanageable. The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Clara could feel the weight of the choice before her safety purchased with anonymity, or the chance to live her own life bought with constant danger. It shouldn't have been a difficult decision, but the thought of disappearing just when she had found something worth staying for felt like another kind of death. What if we testified immediately? Clara asked suddenly. What if we cooperated fully with grand jury proceedings, gave depositions, whatever you need to build your cases? Would that reduce the threat? Agent Martinez considered the question carefully. It might. If we could move quickly enough to arrest the remaining conspirators before they had time to arrange retaliation, and if we could convince some of them to cooperate in exchange for reduced sentences, we might be able to neutralize the threat relatively quickly. How quickly? Jonathan asked. Weeks rather than months if everything goes perfectly. But Miss Bennett, Mr. Drake, I have to stress that this would be an enormous gamble. You would be betting your lives on our ability to outmaneuver people who have been successfully evading law enforcement for years. Clara thought of her father alone with his suspicions and his integrity trying to do the right thing in a world that punished such impulses. She thought of all the other employees who had died for asking inconvenient questions, who had paid with their lives for refusing to look the other way when they witnessed corruption and fraud. And she thought of the diary that had started this entire chain of events filled with observations and feelings that had seemed so dangerous to put in writing, but had ultimately become the key to exposing a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of corporate and political power. I want to testify, Clara said firmly. I want to tell the truth about what happened to my father, about what these people have been doing, about everything I've witnessed and documented. And I want to do it as Clara Bennett, not as some anonymous witness hiding behind federal protection. Agent Martinez studied her face intently. Miss Bennett, I need you to understand that if you make this choice, there will be no changing your mind later. Once you testify publicly, once your name is attached to this case, the people who want to silence you will know exactly where to find you. They already know where to find me, Clara replied. They've been watching me for weeks, planning my death, using my feelings for Jonathan as a weapon against both of us. I'm tired of being afraid, tired of running from shadows, tired of letting other people make decisions about my life. She stood up, surprised by how steady her legs felt despite everything she had been through. My father spent his entire career being the kind of man who did what was right even when it was difficult. He died because he wouldn't look the other way when he saw corruption, because he believed that the truth was worth defending, regardless of the personal cost. If I disappear into witness protection now, if I let fear make my decisions for me, then his death was meaningless. Jonathan was looking at her with an expression that was equal parts admiration and terror. Clara, what you're saying is brave, but nothing, Clara interrupted. We started this together and we're going to finish it together. As ourselves, not as some federal protection program success story. Agent Martinez was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming against her tablet as she weighed Clara's words against the professional obligation to keep witnesses alive long enough to testify. Finally, she sighed and made a note that Clara couldn't see. If that's your decision, Miss Bennett, then we'll need to move very quickly. Grand jury proceedings can begin as early as tomorrow if the prosecutors are willing to work around the clock, which they will be once they see the evidence you've provided. But I'm going to insist on protective custody until the immediate threat is neutralized, and I'm going to recommend that both of you consider relocating once this is over. Relocating where? Jonathan asked. Anywhere that isn't here. New city, new jobs, new identities if necessary. The Drake Industries name is going to be toxic once this story breaks, and anyone associated with the company is going to be under intense scrutiny for months or years to come. Clara felt her heart sink at the agent's words. She had been so focused on the immediate threat that she hadn't considered the long-term consequences of exposing the conspiracy. Even if they survived the retaliation attempts, even if justice was served and the guilty parties were imprisoned, the company that had been her father's life's work would be destroyed in the process. What will happen to Drake Industries? She asked. Agent Martinez's expression was sympathetic but realistic. The company will probably survive in some form, but it will be fundamentally changed. New management, new board of directors, probably new ownership structure. The employees who weren't involved in the conspiracy will keep their jobs, but the culture and leadership that enabled this level of corruption will have to be completely rebuilt. Jonathan's face was grim as he processed the implications. Everything my father built, everything he worked for, it's all going to be dismantled. Not dismantled, Agent Martinez corrected gently. Reformed. The legitimate parts of the business, the employees who were doing honest work, the projects that actually benefit society, all of that will continue. But the rot that allowed people like Gerald Henderson to operate with impunity, that enabled a culture where questioning authority was punished and looking the other way was rewarded, that has to be cut out completely. Clara reached for Jonathan's hand, intertwining their fingers in a gesture that felt both comforting and defiant. Maybe that's what your father would have wanted. Maybe he would rather see his company transformed into something better than watch it continue to be corrupted from within. Jonathan squeezed her hand, drawing strength from her touch. Maybe you're right. Maybe this is the only way to honor what he really tried to build. Agent Martinez watched their interaction with the kind of professional interest that suggested she was cataloging their relationship for her report. I take it you two plan to face whatever comes next together. Yes, Clara said without hesitation. Whatever happens, we face it together. The next several hours passed in a blur of statements, depositions, and legal procedures that Clara barely understood. Federal prosecutors arrived with boxes of documents and expressions of grim determination, transforming the archive into an impromptu command center for building cases against some of the most powerful people in corporate America. Clara found herself repeating her story dozens of times, each revealing new details that the investigators seized upon with obvious excitement. The photographs she had taken in the archive were blown up and displayed on portable screens, creating a visual timeline of corruption that stretched back years and implicated individuals whose names appeared regularly in the business press. David Kim arrived at some point during the night, escorted by federal agents who had tracked him down through his association with Clara. His face was pale with shock as he learned the true scope of the conspiracy he had unknowingly helped expose, but his testimony about the falsified financial projections provided crucial corroboration for Clara's evidence. "I can't believe I was working for people who were planning to destroy the company," David said during a break in his interview. "I mean, I knew something was wrong with the numbers, but I never imagined it was part of something this big." "None of us did," Clara replied. "That's how they got away with it for so long. It was too big, too audacious for anyone to believe it was really happening." As dawn approached, Clara found herself alone with Jonathan in a small conference room that the FBI had commandeered for private conversations with key witnesses. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in the harsh, white glow that seemed to be a prerequisite for government buildings, and Clara could see the exhaustion in Jonathan's eyes that matched her own bone-deep weariness. "Do you regret it?" Jonathan asked quietly. "Getting involved in all this, I mean. Your life would have been so much simpler if you had just lost that diary and never found it again." Clara considered the question seriously, thinking about the path that had brought her to this moment. "A month ago, I would have said yes. I would have given anything to just be invisible, to do my job and collect my paycheck and never have to worry about corporate conspiracies or federal investigations or whether powerful people wanted me dead." She paused, studying Jonathan's face in the harsh light. "But now I think this is exactly where I'm supposed to be. My father spent his whole life fighting for what was right, and he died before he could finish the work. Maybe it was always meant to be me who finished it." Jonathan's smile was soft and sad and filled with an emotion that made Clara's chest tight with longing. "I love you," he said simply. "I know this isn't the time or the place, and I know everything is uncertain right now, but I needed you to know that. Whatever happens next, whatever we have to face, I love you." The words hit Clara like a physical shock, not because they were unexpected, but because they made everything else, the danger, the uncertainty, the complete upheaval of their lives, seem manageable by comparison. "I love you too," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think I've been in love with you since the first time I saw you in a board meeting, trying to do the right thing, even when everyone else just wanted to hear what they expected to hear." They sat in silence for a moment, hands clasped across the small table, drawing strength from each other in the artificial daylight of the government building. Outside, Clara knew the sun was rising on a world that would soon learn about the conspiracy that had been operating in the shadows of one of America's most respected corporations. By evening, their names and faces would be on every news channel, their story told and retold, until it became part of the national conversation about corporate responsibility and the price of speaking truth to power. Agent Martinez appeared in the doorway, her expression suggesting that the next phase of their ordeal was about to begin. "Miss Bennett, Mr. Drake, we're ready to transport you to a secure location where you can rest before the grand jury proceedings begin this afternoon. The prosecutors want to move as quickly as possible before word of the arrests leaks to the media." Clara stood up slowly, her body protesting for hours of sitting in uncomfortable government furniture. "What kind of secure location?" "Safe house about 20 miles outside the city. Isolated, well-protected, equipped with everything you'll need for however long this takes." Agent Martinez's expression was professionally neutral, but Clara caught a hint of sympathy in her eyes. "I know this isn't how either of you expected your lives to go, but you've done something extraordinary here. The evidence you've provided will probably prevent hundreds of other crimes, save thousands of jobs, and maybe even prevent some deaths." As they prepared to leave the archive that had been the scene of their victory and near disaster, Clara took one last look around the underground chamber, where her father's killers had finally been brought to justice. The space looked different now, less threatening, and more like what it actually was, a repository of history, a place where the truth was stored and preserved for future generations to learn from. "Ready?" Jonathan asked, offering her his arm like a gentleman escorting a lady to dinner, rather than a witness being taken to protective custody. Clara smiled and took his arm, feeling the solid warmth of his presence beside her. "Ready?" she said, and meant it. They walked together toward whatever came next, knowing that they faced an uncertain future, but confident that they would face it together. Behind them, federal agents continued the painstaking work of dismantling a conspiracy that had cost too many lives and corrupted too many institutions. Ahead of them lay grand jury testimony, media attention, and the slow process of rebuilding their lives in a world that had been fundamentally changed by their courage to speak the truth. But in that moment, walking arm in arm through the corridors of Drake Industries one last time, Clara felt something she hadn't experienced since her father's death. A sense of completion, of having honored his memory in the most meaningful way possible. The diary that had started their journey had been about more than her observations and feelings. It had been about the responsibility to bear witness, to record the truth, even when that truth was dangerous. Now that truth was free, and so were they. The safe house sat on a wooded hillside 23 miles outside the city, its unassuming exterior designed to blend seamlessly with the suburban landscape that surrounded it. Clara stood at the living room window, watching dawn paint the sky in shades of rose and gold, while federal agents maintained their vigilant patrol of the property perimeter. 6 weeks had passed since that night in the archive. 6 weeks of testimony and depositions and media storms that had transformed their private tragedy into a national conversation about corporate accountability. Jonathan emerged from the kitchen carrying 2 cups of coffee, his hair still damp from the shower, and his face bearing the kind of exhaustion that came from weeks of legal proceedings and sleepless nights. The safe house had become their temporary home, their sanctuary from a world that suddenly wanted to dissect every detail of their lives and relationship. But Clara could see in his eyes the same restlessness that had been building in her own heart. "The prosecutors called," Jonathan said, settling beside her on the worn leather couch that had probably housed dozens of federal witnesses over the years. The last of the Westridge executives pled guilty yesterday. Richard Cromwell got 15 years, Patricia Walsh got 12, and Thomas Morrison agreed to cooperate in exchange for 8 years and restitution. Clara accepted the coffee gratefully, savoring the warmth that spread through her fingers as she gripped the ceramic mug. "What about the politicians?" "Senator Bradley resigned yesterday and will probably face charges within the month. Congressman Peters is fighting the allegations, but the FBI found offshore accounts containing over $2 million in payments from shell companies connected to the conspiracy." Jonathan's voice carried a grim satisfaction that spoke of justice finally being served, though Clara could hear the underlying sadness for the institutions that had been corrupted in the process. The political ramifications had been almost as shocking as the corporate conspiracy itself. 3 senators, 5 congressmen, and a federal judge had been implicated in the scheme to facilitate the Westridge merger through regulatory manipulation and favorable legal rulings. The evidence Clara had photographed in the archive had unraveled a web of corruption that reached from corporate boardrooms to the halls of Congress. "Agent Martinez thinks we'll be able to leave protective custody next week," Jonathan continued. "The immediate threat has been neutralized, and most of the remaining targets are more focused on their own legal problems than on revenge. Clara nodded, though the prospect of returning to normal life felt both liberating and terrifying. For 6 weeks, their world had been reduced to the safe house, the federal courthouse, and the carefully controlled interactions with lawyers and investigators. The idea of walking freely through a city street, of making their own decisions about where to go and what to do, seemed almost foreign after so much time in protective custody. "Have you decided what you want to do?" Clara asked. "About the company, I mean. About your future." Jonathan was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the wooded landscape that had become their temporary horizon. "The board wants me to stay on as CEO during the restructuring process. They think having someone with my name and history will help rebuild confidence with investors and employees." "But," Clara prompted, hearing the hesitation in his voice, "but I'm not sure I want to spend the rest of my life trying to repair damage that never should have happened in the first place." Jonathan set down his coffee and turned to face her fully. "The company will survive. It's too big and too embedded in the economy to simply disappear. But it will never be what my father envisioned. Never be the kind of place where people like your father can pursue integrity without fear of retaliation." Clara studied his face, seeing the weight of a decision that would determine not just his own future, but the futures of thousands of employees who depended on Drake Industries for their livelihoods. "What would you do instead?" "There's a foundation that investigates corporate fraud and helps whistleblowers navigate the legal system safely. They've offered me a position heading their corporate accountability division." Jonathan's eyes met hers with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "The salary would be about 1/10 of what I make now, and the work would be dangerous and often thankless. But it would be meaningful in a way that maximizing shareholder value never could be." The idea of Jonathan walking away from the empire his father had built should have shocked Clara, but instead she felt a surge of admiration for his willingness to choose purpose over profit. "You'd be helping people like my father. People who see corruption and want to do something about it, but don't know how to protect themselves." "Exactly." And Clara, Jonathan reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers in the gesture that had become their anchor in the storm of the past 6 weeks. "They've also offered you a position. Lead investigator specializing in financial analysis and pattern recognition. Apparently, your work in exposing the Drake Industries conspiracy has made you something of a legend in the whistleblower protection community." Clara felt her breath catch in her throat. 6 weeks ago, she had been an anonymous administrative assistant, invisible and unremarkable in the vast machinery of corporate America. Now she was being offered the chance to turn her father's tragedy into a tool for protecting others who found themselves in similar situations. "I don't have formal training in investigation," Clara said, though her heart was already racing with the possibilities. "I just paid attention to details that other people missed." "Which is exactly what makes you valuable," Jonathan replied. "You see patterns because you're not trained to ignore them. You ask questions because you don't know you're not supposed to. And you have the courage to act on what you discover, even when acting means risking everything." Through the window, Clara could see Agent Martinez approaching the house, her purposeful stride suggesting that she carried news that would change their carefully regulated routine. But for a moment, Clara allowed herself to imagine a different kind of future, one where she and Jonathan worked together to expose corruption and protect the innocent, where her father's death became the catalyst for preventing other deaths, where their love story became part of a larger narrative about justice and redemption. Agent Martinez knocked softly before entering, her expression carrying the kind of professional satisfaction that suggested good news. "I have updates from the prosecution team," she announced, settling into the chair across from their couch. and some information about your future that I think you'll want to hear." Clara and Jonathan exchanged glances, sensing that whatever Agent Martinez was about to tell them would mark the end of one chapter of their lives and the beginning of another. The grand jury returned indictments against 17 additional defendants yesterday, Agent Martinez began, including 3 executives from companies that weren't directly involved in the Westridge merger, but were using similar schemes to manipulate their own acquisition deals. Your testimony has opened up investigations into corporate fraud networks that we didn't even know existed. The magnitude of their impact was still difficult for Clara to comprehend. What had begun as a personal quest for truth about her father's death had become the foundation for a nationwide crackdown on corporate corruption that would probably continue for years. More importantly, Agent Martinez continued, the Justice Department has decided to create a new task force specifically focused on corporate murder-for-hire schemes. Based on your case, they've identified patterns in other suspicious deaths that suggest this type of conspiracy is more common than anyone realized. Jonathan's grip on Clara's hand tightened. You're saying there are other companies doing what Gerald and his associates did. We're saying there are other companies where employees who ask inconvenient questions have a statistically improbable tendency to die of natural causes, Agent Martinez replied grimly. Your father wasn't the only David Bennett, Miss Bennett. There are dozens of cases across the country where honest employees died under suspicious circumstances after discovering evidence of fraud or corruption. The weight of that revelation settled over Clara like a shroud. Her father's death hadn't been an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern of corporate violence that had been hidden behind the veneer of respectability and legitimate business practices. The task force wants both of you to serve as consultants, Agent Martinez said. Your experience with this type of conspiracy, combined with your willingness to testify publicly, makes you ideal candidates to help other victims and their families find justice. Clara felt a surge of emotion that was equal parts grief and determination. How many families are we talking about? At least 40 cases that show similar patterns to your father's death. Probably more once we start publicizing the task force and encouraging people to come forward with their suspicions. Agent Martinez leaned forward, her expression intense. This could be your father's true legacy, Miss Bennett. Not just the exposure of one conspiracy, but the creation of a system that protects other people from suffering the same loss you experienced. The idea was overwhelming and inspiring in equal measure. Clara thought of other daughters and sons who had lost parents to corporate greed, other families who had been told that their loved ones' deaths were natural and unavoidable. The chance to give those families the answers and justice that had been denied to her for so long felt like a calling that transcended any personal considerations. What would it involve? Jonathan asked. The consulting work, I mean. Reviewing case files, identifying patterns that local investigators might miss, testifying in cases where your experience is relevant, and most importantly, helping develop protocols that will make it harder for corporations to eliminate whistleblowers without facing immediate federal investigation. Agent Martinez pulled out a tablet and showed them a map of the United States dotted with red markers that represented suspicious corporate deaths over the past decade. The pattern was chilling in its scope, a constellation of tragedies that had been dismissed as coincidences until Clara's case provided the template for recognizing them as crimes. The foundation that offered you positions is partnering with the Justice Department on this initiative, Agent Martinez explained. You'd have federal backing and resources, but you'd also have the independence to pursue cases that might be politically sensitive or involve powerful interests. Clara stared at the map, seeing her father's story reflected in dozens of other cases across the country. The responsibility was enormous, but so was the opportunity to ensure that David Bennett's death would save other lives, rather than simply being one more casualty in the war between profit and principle. "There's something else," Agent Martinez said, her tone shifting to something more personal. "The media attention around your case has generated significant public interest in corporate accountability. Publishers are interested in your story. Documentary filmmakers want to explore the broader implications of corporate violence, and several universities have expressed interest in having you speak about your experience." The prospect of sharing their story with the world was both thrilling and terrifying. Clara had seen the news coverage of their case the way reporters had tried to sensationalize their relationship, while missing the deeper questions about corporate power and individual responsibility. The idea of controlling their own narrative, of ensuring that the real lessons of their experience reached the people who needed to hear them, was appealing despite the loss of privacy it would entail. "We need time to think about it," Jonathan said, though Clara could see in his eyes that he had already made his decision. "All of it. The foundation positions the task force consulting the media opportunities. It's a lot to process." Agent Martinez nodded understandingly. "Take all the time you need. But Miss Bennett, Mr. Drake, I want you to know that what you've accomplished here goes far beyond seeking justice for one man's death. You've created a roadmap for holding corporate power accountable, and you've shown other people that it's possible to fight back against corruption without being destroyed in the process." She stood to leave, then paused at the door. "There's one more thing. The families of the other employees who died under suspicious circumstances, they want to meet you, to thank you for giving them hope that their loved ones' deaths weren't meaningless." After Agent Martinez left, Clara and Jonathan sat in silence for a long time, each processing the magnitude of the choice before them. Outside, the sun climbed higher in the sky, promising another beautiful autumn day in their temporary sanctuary. But Clara's mind was already moving beyond the safe house, beyond the protected isolation that had defined their lives for the past 6 weeks. "My father would want us to do it," Clara said finally. "All of it. The foundation work, the task force, the media interviews. He believed that the truth was worth fighting for, even when fighting meant risking everything you had to lose." Jonathan's smile was soft and sad, and filled with the kind of love that could survive any challenge. "Are you sure? Because once we step back into the public eye, once we become the faces of corporate accountability and whistleblower protection, there will be no going back to anonymous, quiet lives. I was never meant for an anonymous, quiet life," Clara replied, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "I thought I was for a long time after my father died. I thought the safest thing was to blend in, to never draw attention, to never give anyone a reason to notice me. But safety isn't the same thing as living, and I'm tired of surviving when I could be making a difference." She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the landscape that had sheltered them while they healed from the trauma of their ordeal. "Besides, someone has to make sure that other David Bennetts don't die alone with their suspicions and their integrity. Someone has to make sure that other Clara Bennetts don't spend years wondering if their father's deaths were meaningless." Jonathan joined her at the window, his arm sliding around her waist, in a gesture that felt both protective and supportive. "It won't be easy. There will be other conspiracies, other powerful people who don't want their secrets exposed, other attempts to silence us or discredit our work. Nothing worthwhile is ever easy," Clara said, leaning into his embrace. "But we won't be doing it alone this time. We'll have each other, and we'll have the support of people who believe that truth and justice are worth fighting for." 3 months later, Clara stood behind a podium in the auditorium of Georgetown University, looking out at an audience of law students, journalism majors, and faculty members who had come to hear her speak about corporate accountability and the power of individual courage. The room was packed with additional attendees watching via live stream, and Clara could feel the weight of their attention as she prepared to share lessons learned through tragedy and transformed into hope. 6 months ago, Clara began, her voice carrying clearly through the sound system. I was nobody special, an administrative assistant in a large corporation invisible to the people who made the important decisions, unremarkable in every way that our society typically measures significance. She paused, scanning the faces in the audience and seeing reflections of her former self, young people who believed they had no power to change the systems they found themselves navigating. But I had something that turned out to be more valuable than money or position or connections. I had a father who taught me to pay attention to details, to ask questions when things didn't make sense, and to never accept that injustice is inevitable simply because it's profitable. Clara's presentation included photographs from her father's life, David Bennett, at his desk working late to ensure that the numbers added up correctly. David Bennett at Clara's high school graduation, proud of his daughter's achievements despite the financial struggles that limited their options. David Bennett, in his final months, carrying burdens he couldn't share but never abandoning his commitment to doing what was right. My father died because he discovered a conspiracy that threatened to destroy the company he had served faithfully for 15 years. He died because powerful people decided that his integrity was inconvenient, and his silence was more valuable than his life. Clara's voice carried the weight of grief that had been transformed into purpose. But his death also created the opportunity for justice because the patterns he identified and the evidence he gathered became the foundation for exposing a network of corruption that had been operating in plain sight for years. The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word, as Clara described the night in the archive, the federal investigation that followed, and the ongoing work of the task force that now bore her father's name. The David Bennett Corporate Accountability Initiative had already investigated 12 cases of suspicious deaths among corporate whistleblowers, resulting in indictments against 37 defendants and the recovery of over $200 million in fraudulent assets. The most important lesson I learned, Clara continued, is that individual courage can change systems that seem too big and too powerful to be affected by the actions of ordinary people. But that courage has to be supported by institutions that protect the vulnerable, by laws that make accountability enforceable, and by a culture that values truth more than comfort. During the question and answer session that followed, a young woman in the third row raised her hand with obvious nervousness. Miss Bennett, what advice would you give to someone who suspects corruption at their workplace but is afraid of the consequences of speaking up? Clara considered the question carefully, thinking of her own journey from fearful silence to purposeful action. Document everything carefully and discreetly. Find allies who share your concerns, and remember that the consequences of speaking up, however severe they might be, are rarely worse than the consequences of remaining silent while preventable harm continues to occur. She paused, looking directly at the young woman who had asked the question. But most importantly, don't try to fight corruption alone. There are organizations now, foundations, legal aid societies, federal task forces that exist specifically to protect and support people who find themselves in your situation. The path my father walked alone is one that no one should have to walk anymore. After the presentation, Clara made her way through the crowd of students and faculty who wanted to continue the conversation, each interaction reinforcing her belief that the work she and Jonathan had chosen was making a real difference in the world. As she finally emerged from the auditorium into the crisp autumn air, she found Jonathan waiting for her with the kind of proud smile that made her heart skip a beat. "How did it go?" he asked, falling into step beside her as they walked across the campus toward their car. "Better than I expected," These students are so smart, so passionate about justice and accountability. It gives me hope that the next generation will build better systems than the ones we inherited." Clara slipped her hand into his, marveling at how natural the gesture had become over the months since they had left protective custody. "How was your meeting with the senator's office?" "Productive. They're interested in expanding federal funding for whistleblower protection programs, and they want our input on legislation that would create mandatory reporting requirements for corporations when employees die under suspicious circumstances." Jonathan's voice carried the satisfaction of someone who had found meaningful work after years of feeling trapped by obligations and expectations. Their new life together was nothing like what either of them had imagined 6 months earlier. Instead of corporate luxury and executive privilege, they shared a modest apartment near the Foundation's headquarters, their daily routine structured around case reviews, congressional testimony, and speaking engagements that took them across the country. The work was difficult and sometimes dangerous, but it was also filled with purpose in a way that their previous lives had never been. "There's something I want to show you," Clara said as they reached their car. She pulled out her phone and opened an email that had arrived during her presentation. "It's from Sarah Morrison. Her husband was one of the employees who died under suspicious circumstances at Meridian Industries. The FBI just arrested 3 executives there, and the family is finally getting answers about what really happened." Jonathan read over her shoulder, his expression softening as he absorbed the gratitude and relief in Sarah Morrison's message. 23 families now have gotten closure because of the work we're doing. 23 families who thought they would never know the truth about their loved ones' deaths. 23 fathers, mothers, sons, and daughters who didn't die in vain, Clara added. 23 people whose integrity and courage are being honored through the justice they were denied in life. They drove home in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts about the day's work and the case's still pending investigation. As they pulled into their parking space, Clara noticed a familiar figure waiting on the steps of their building, Agent Martinez, whose involvement in their case had evolved into something resembling friendship over the months of their collaboration. "I hope this isn't about another threat assessment," Jonathan said as they approached the building, though his tone was more resigned than worried. The death threats and intimidation attempts had decreased significantly as more conspirators were arrested and imprisoned, but they hadn't stopped entirely. Agent Martinez smiled and shook her head. "Actually, I have good news for once. The last of the Westridge conspirators was sentenced today. Harold Westridge himself got 25 years without possibility of parole. And the judge made specific mention of the courage shown by the witnesses whose testimony made the convictions possible." Clara felt a surge of satisfaction that was tempered by the knowledge that no amount of prison time could bring back her father or undo the damage that had been done to so many families. But justice, even imperfect justice, was better than the silence and complicity that had allowed the conspiracy to flourish for so long. "There's something else," Agent Martinez continued, her expression becoming more serious. "The Justice Department wants to expand the Corporate Accountability Task Force into a permanent division. They're offering you both permanent positions with full federal benefits and authority to investigate cases anywhere in the country." The offer was both flattering and daunting. Accepting would mean becoming full-time federal investigators with all the resources and authority that entailed, but it would also mean giving up the independence and flexibility that had made their current work so satisfying. "We'll need to discuss it," Clara said, exchanging glances with Jonathan. "It's a big decision, and we've learned not to make big decisions quickly." Agent Martinez nodded understandingly. "Take all the time you need. But I will say this, the work you've done over the past few months has prevented more corporate violence than we'll probably ever know. Every executive who thinks twice before ordering intimidation or retaliation every whistleblower who comes forward because they know they won't face their fears alone, every family that gets answers instead of empty condolences, all of that exists because you two decided that your comfort was less important than other people's safety. That evening, Clara and Jonathan sat on their small balcony overlooking the city, sharing a bottle of wine and watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. The diary that had started their journey lay open on the table between them, its pages now supplemented by newspaper clippings, photographs, and letters from families whose lives had been touched by their work. "Do you ever regret it?" Jonathan asked, echoing the question Clara had posed to him months earlier in the safe house. "Everything we gave up, I mean. The quiet life, the financial security, the anonymity." Clara considered the question seriously, thinking about the assistant's desk. She no longer occupied the predictable routine, she no longer followed the safety that came from never drawing attention to herself. "Sometimes I miss the simplicity of it. There's something appealing about knowing exactly what each day will bring about, having problems that can be solved by working harder or being more careful." She picked up the diary and flipped through its pages, pausing at the entry that had revealed her feelings for Jonathan, and set in motion the chain of events that had changed both their lives forever. "But then I think about my father sitting in his cubicle, with his suspicions and his integrity dying alone because he didn't have anyone he could trust with the truth he had discovered. And I think about all the other families who are getting closure now because we were willing to take risks that felt impossibly dangerous at the time." Clara closed the diary and looked at Jonathan, seeing in his face the same mix of exhaustion and fulfillment that she felt in her own heart. "I don't regret loving you. I don't regret trusting you with my father's secrets. And I don't regret choosing a life that matters over a life that's safe." Jonathan's smile was soft and filled with the kind of love that could survive any challenge. "I love you too. More than I thought it was possible to love someone, and in ways I didn't know existed before I met you." He reached across the table and took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm in the gesture that had become their private language of comfort and connection. "Whatever we decide about the Justice Department, or whatever comes next in our work, I want you to know that finding you loving you has been the best thing that ever happened to me." Clara felt tears prick at her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming gratitude she felt for the path that had brought them together. "Even though loving me has meant giving up everything you thought you wanted from life, especially because of that," Jonathan replied. "Turns out everything I thought I wanted was just a way of avoiding everything I actually needed." As the sun disappeared behind the city skyline, Clara thought about the choice before them: federal employment that would give them more resources but less independence, the chance to make an even bigger impact, but within a bureaucratic structure that might limit their effectiveness. It was the kind of decision that would have paralyzed her 6 months earlier, when the weight of choosing wrong had seemed too heavy to bear. But now Clara understood that there were no perfect choices, only choices that aligned with your values, and choices that betrayed them. The specific details of their future mattered less than their commitment to continue the work that honored her father's memory and protected other families from suffering the losses that had defined her own life. "Whatever we decide," Clara said, squeezing Jonathan's hand, "we decide together. And whatever we do it because it's right, not because it's safe or easy or profitable." 3 weeks later, Clara stood in the cemetery where her father was buried, holding a letter that had arrived that morning from the families of the 29 corporate whistleblowers whose deaths had been investigated by the task force. 23 cases had resulted in arrests and convictions, while 6 remained under active investigation, with promising leads that suggested justice would eventually be served. The letter was signed by every family member who had been directly affected by corporate violence, expressing gratitude not just for the investigations that had brought their loved ones' killers to justice, but for the hope that future families would not suffer the same losses. Reading their words, Clara felt the presence of her father the more strongly than she had since the night she had first written about her suspicions in the diary that changed everything. "We did it, Dad," she whispered, placing fresh flowers on David Bennett's grave. "We finished what you started, and we made sure that other daughters won't have to wonder if their fathers died for nothing." Jonathan stood beside her in respectful silence, understanding that this moment belonged to Clara and her father, that the conversation she needed to have was one that transcended the physical boundaries between the living and the dead. When Clara was ready, she would share with him what she had decided about their future, and he would support whatever choice she made. But Clara already knew what her decision would be. The federal position would give them more resources and authority, but it would also constrain their ability to speak freely about the systemic problems that enabled corporate violence. The foundation work allowed them to pursue cases that might be politically sensitive, to advocate for families who had no other voice, to build coalitions that could change laws and policies rather than simply enforcing existing ones. "I want to expand this foundation," Clara said, as they walked back to their car. "I want to create training programs for corporate employees who suspect wrongdoing, legal clinics for families of suspicious deaths, and educational initiatives that teach people to recognize the warning signs of corporate conspiracy." Jonathan's smile was proud and unsurprised. "That sounds like exactly what your father would want his legacy to be." "It sounds like exactly what we were meant to do with our lives," Clara corrected. "Together." 6 months later, the David Bennett Foundation for Corporate Accountability had grown from a small nonprofit organization into a nationally recognized advocate for whistleblower protection and corporate transparency. Clara and Jonathan worked side by side in its expanded headquarters, surrounded by a team of investigators, lawyers, and advocates who shared their commitment to ensuring that profit could never again be prioritized over human life. The foundation's success was measured not in dollars raised or media attention generated, but in lives saved and families protected. Corporate executives now thought twice before ordering retaliation against honest employees, knowing that suspicious deaths would trigger immediate investigation by experienced federal agents. Employees with concerns about workplace safety or financial irregularities had resources and support that hadn't existed before Clara's father died alone with his suspicions. Clara's diary, the small leather journal that had started their journey, now occupied a place of honor in the foundation's lobby, opened to the final entry where she had written about her growing feelings for Jonathan. Visitors often paused to read those words, understanding that the love story contained within its pages was inseparable from the larger story of courage and justice that the foundation represented. "Do you think he would be proud?" Clara asked one evening as she and Jonathan reviewed case files in their shared office, the city lights twinkling beyond their windows like stars that had descended to earth. Jonathan looked up from the financial records he was analyzing, his expression leaving no doubt about his answer. "I think David Bennett would be amazed by what his daughter accomplished, humbled by the lives that have been saved in his name, and grateful that his death led to something beautiful instead of just another tragedy." Clara nodded, feeling the truth of his words settle into her heart like a benediction. Her father's death had been the catalyst for everything that followed her relationship with Jonathan, their fight against corporate corruption, the foundation that now protected other families from similar losses. David Bennett's integrity and courage lived on in every case they investigated, every family they helped. Every corporate executive who chose transparency over conspiracy because they knew the consequences of choosing otherwise. "I love you." Clara said the words, carrying all the weight of everything they had been through together. Everything they had built from the ashes of tragedy and loss. "I love you too," Jonathan replied, reaching across their shared desk to take her hand. "Today, tomorrow, and for whatever comes next." Outside their office window, the city sparkled with the lights of millions of people pursuing their own dreams and facing their own challenges. Somewhere among those lights, there might be another David Bennett working late in a corporate office, discovering evidence of corruption that could cost him everything. But unlike Clara's father, that person would not face their fears alone. They would have advocates and resources, legal protection, and moral support. The knowledge that speaking truth to power was dangerous, but not hopeless. Clara picked up her pen and opened a new notebook, not a diary this time, but a case file for the Foundation's next investigation. As she began to write, documenting the details that would help another family find justice, she felt her father's presence in every word, his values guiding every decision, his love for truth and justice living on in the work that had become her life's purpose. The diary that had changed everything now rested safely in its display case, its secrets revealed and its power transformed from personal confession into public inspiration. But the real story it had told about the courage to love, the strength to fight injustice, and the power of ordinary people to change systems that seemed unchangeable continued to unfold in the lives of everyone who encountered its message. Clara Bennett had lost her diary and found her destiny. In finding her voice, she had discovered not just love, but the purpose that gave that love meaning. And in honoring her father's memory, she had created a legacy that would protect other families long after her own story had passed into the history of those who chose courage over comfort, truth over safety, and justice over silence. The final entry in Clara's old diary had been about falling in love with Jonathan Drake. But the real love story, the one that mattered most, was about falling in love with the possibility of making the world better, one case at a time, one family at a time, one act of courage at a time. And that love story would never end.